Today we are looking at a loudspeaker called the DWX, and it is a large, high-efficiency stand-mount loudspeaker from Zoo Audio. But rather unusually, at this particular price point, we'll come back to that in a minute, it is not made in China, but made in the US of A.
This episode is brought to you by Made by Music, the new podcast from Cambridge Audio.
Welcome back, everybody. Yes, the DWX is a direct descendant of the DW6 floor stander, or Dirty Weekend floor stander, that Zoo Audio has been making in sporadic runs for the last 4 or 5 years. Now, Zoo Audio reckon that the DWX sound very close to the floor stander. I cannot confirm or deny that because I think it's obvious, I don't have a pair of the floor stander here. I've only got one pair of the DWX here right now. But any sonic similarities between the DWX and the DW6 might be because they both use the same 10 inch full range driver, in this case that sits right in the middle of the front baffle. And I think 10 inches is very unusual at this price point. And material nerds might want to know that the driver here is made of a paper pulp based material. And it's called a full range driver, not because it goes from 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz, but because it runs its full natural range. And that means it starts at about 38 hertz and I think begins to roll off at about 12 kilohertz, which is where the super tweeter comes in. That's where it takes over from the full range driver. But there is no crossover applied to that full range driver. I recall a few years ago talking to Sean Casey, and he described crossovers as complete tone killers. So the only filter that you'll find inside the DWX is actually applied to that super tweeter. It's a first order filter, just so that it kind of crosses over properly with the natural roll off of the full range driver. But remember, this sort of crossover point, even though there's no crossover on the full range driver, this crossover point is taking place at 12 kilohertz. Now, in most loudspeakers, that takes place roughly at 2 to 3 kilohertz. There are exceptions, obviously, but generally 2 to 3, which is why in this particular case, we're calling it a super tweeter, because that super tweeter is only taking over at 12K. So please bear that in mind as we move forward. And as you can probably see behind me, there is a bass reflex port sitting on the front of the loudspeaker. It's not on the back. Now, in practical terms, that means that we can put the DWX closer to the front wall. The front wall is the one behind me. We can put it closer to the front wall if we need to, because the port is firing forwards. And no, I have not noticed any sound coming from that port at the volume levels that I listen to in my 6 meter by 5 meter room. Now, I'm not a loud listener, but I rarely go beyond 85 dB at the listening seat. What about pricing? Well, I have the Supreme version of the DWX, which includes upgraded capacitors. Remember the capacitor on the filter, on the super tweeter, and it also features upgraded wiring, and that sells for roughly $2,500 US. But the base model DWX can be had for $1,400 US. Now, Sean Casey says there's not a huge difference between the base and the Supreme version that I have, but I cannot, again, confirm or deny that because I only have one pair of DWX here, and that's the Supreme version. However, whichever version you buy, you still get a very nicely made loudspeaker. It features a chunky cabinet. It feels chunky anyway, and you knock on it, it feels pretty solid. It is real wood veneer on the outside of that cabinet. And then you'll notice that there is a very sturdy aluminium ring that runs around that full range driver. There's a big, substantial, chunky phase plug right in the middle of the full range driver. And then there's also an aluminium waveguide, again, solidly made, that helps disperse the super tweeter's output into the room. And the whole thing is made and sold from Zoo Audio's factory in Ogden, Utah. And not having dealer and distributor margins applied to their price model means that Zoo have an inherent advantage over loudspeaker manufacturers like Wharfedale or PSB or Bowers & Wilkins. Although I'm not sure how worldwide distribution, so outside of the USA, affects those margins. Maybe the Zoo speakers are more expensive in your territory because they're not being sold direct from Utah, they're going through a distributor in your local territory. But I can't speak to that because I can't possibly know what goes on in all of the territories beyond the USA, really. I have a recommended album for you today, and it's quite an unusual one. It's by an outfit called Deadstock, who I think only made this and another single in the mid-90s. This came out on Internal, which was the same label that Orbital were on in the 90s. And this is for people who like the sort of calmer side of Underworld or Fluke. There are vocals on some tracks. And it's quite downbeat in some places. It's a bit more intense than others. But there's one track on here, which is why I bought this EP way back when. It's called Six-Sided Something. And it features a sample from Blue Velvet. It's a sample of Frank Booth in that scene. So no, I'm not going to quote it because it's not family friendly. So if you want to hear what that sounds like, you're going to have to buy this because it's not on streaming services. It's pretty easy to get on Discogs, I think. And I think the CD's pretty easy to get as well. So yeah, the self-titled EP from Deadstock, it says True LP 12, I guess that's the catalogue number on the side here, is my recommended album for this video. Now, one of the key features of Zoo loudspeakers, and the DWX is no exception, is high efficiency. Now, Zoo rate these at around 95 dB. And in real-world applications, that means that these loudspeakers play just beautifully with the Audiolab 6000A Play. And I can't say that about the Bowers & Wilkins 705 S3. They sound like they're struggling a little bit, or rather the amplifier sounds like it's struggling to properly drive that other sort of two-way loudspeaker. But I just said two-way. Now, you could look at the Zoo and think, yeah, it's a two-way, but not really, because remember, it's a super tweeter, and only the super tweeter is high-passed, so only the high frequencies come through. Now, the Bowers & Wilkins are rated at 88 dB, so they are much less sensitive than the Zoo audio loudspeakers, and we only have to play something like Craven Falls' sort of fairly expansive electronic soundscapes to hear how the Audiolab combines with the Zoo's 10-inch driver to give us a really sort of meaty mid-range and a full low end, which you don't get from the Bowers & Wilkins with that amplifier. Moreover, the Zoo are much better at lower volumes than the 705 S3. The Bowers take a little bit of a push to wake up fully, and the Zoo do not. So the Zoo are much better, in my opinion, for late night listening, or rather proper satisfaction with late night listening. And perhaps that's being a little bit unfair because I think the 705 S3 from Bowers, they really do need a subwoofer to complete the full range picture. Now, the Zoos I don't think do, well, not always. I guess in the sense that the Wharfedale Linton don't always need a subwoofer. I think many people could do without, especially in smaller rooms. It's much more questionable with the Zoo than it is with the Bowers in terms of needing to add a sub to get that sort of full low end. And that brings us to our first side-by-side comparison, because the Zoo are roughly the same size as the Wharfedale Linton. But if we play some early Bob Dylan, we can hear more detail from the Zoo and I guess a greater sort of treble uplift. And we should definitely point out that going back to the Bowers, so that was a side-by-side comparison I guess as well, going back to the Bowers, both the Zoo and the Wharfedale sound warmer than that 705 S3. And yet they are not the same kind of warm, because to my ears, the more sort of humid vibe, the thicker air that comes out of the Wharfedale Linton when playing something like a Sigur Rós album tends to suggest that they might be a little bit rolled off at the top. I know I've said this before, but I don't think that the Zoo are as rolled off in the top. Instead, their warmth comes from a slightly reticent lower treble. Their presence region isn't especially keen. So I guess we call that a lack of lower treble or presence region bite from the Zoo, which is what I think makes them sound a little bit warmer than the Bowers. But of the three loudspeakers that we're currently sort of swirling around, the DWX are the most exciting sounding of the three, because on dynamics, especially low-end punch and wallop, when playing something like Deadbeat's wildlife documentaries, you can definitely hear how, how thrilling the Zoo sound. Again, even at low volumes. And I do think that the Linton are great at low volumes, but I think the DWX are better. As well they should be, because in my current version, the Supreme version, they sell for twice as much. But the standard version, no, sells for roughly the same as the Wharfedale Linton. Spicy, huh? And whilst we're going long in this video on side-by-side comparisons, let's bring in another loudspeaker. Let's bring in the PSB Passif 50, which I still have here. Now, I've said before that the Passif 50 is quite a polite, laid-back loudspeaker. So by contrast, the Zoo is much more violent with its dynamics. It really shoves and forces sound into the room. And the PSB is just more polite. And that means that the PSB is more laid back and more refined than the Zoo when playing boisterous pop music like Nicki Minaj. So the Zoo are warm, check. They are dynamic, check. They are detailed but not lit up, another check. And a side note here is that when I swapped out the Audiolab amplifier for a beefcake amplifier from Hagel, the H590, a very expensive amplifier, I did notice more sparkle up top from Function's moodier take on techno. It's not all plain sailing though with the DWX. One particular pain point, I think probably the biggest pain point actually, is finding the right stands to put them on. Now the stands that come with the Wharfedale Linton are the perfect width. But I don't think the wooden blocks that sit on the bottom and the underside of the top plate of those stands are a good visual match for the Zoo. And also the Zoo speaker isn't quite as deep as the Linton, so it doesn't quite reach the back of the stand, which means it doesn't kind of sit on the little nipples that I put on there to protect the loudspeaker, which meant initially what I did, I turned that to my advantage and so had the speakers canted back ever so slightly, the Zoo speakers that is. And the net effect I think might be quite predictable for some people in that it gave me ever so slightly, I mean like this much, ever so slightly taller sound staging. You don't have to do this, but it's kind of there if you want it. But once I repositioned the little sort of nipples on the top of the Wharfedale stand and had the Zoos firing straight forward again, it is quite obvious that this is a very large sounding loudspeaker. It's a kind of, I guess to use a marketing cliche, we would call it a room-filling sound, although I know that every loudspeaker pretty much offers a room-filling sound, but the Zoo really seemed to drive the room properly. Again, mine measures 6 meters by 5 meters. So that big dynamic sound means that the Zoo not being too lit up in the top end, or rather in the lower treble, it means that they're very well suited to music from like the likes of Death Grips or Laurent Garnier. I guess the Zoo DWX strike the right balance between being just revealing enough, but also not, God, what am I talking about? But I guess the Zoo strike the right balance between being just revealing enough to let us hear into the music, but not so much as we hear all of that music's flaws, because music like Death Grips and Laurent Garnier isn't perfectly recorded in places. And I think it's much easier to forgive the Zoo's lack of sort of crispness in the lower treble and less overt layer separation when everything sounds so enveloping and so meaty and so expansive. And if I wanted to have my cake and eat it, I hate that saying, but anyway, here we are. If I wanted to basically have the thrilling lower treble and upper mid-range of the Bowers combined with the sort of dynamic, full, meaty sound of the DWX, I would have to fly all the way to my apartment in Portugal and put myself in front of the Zoo Soul 6, which are a much more expensive Zoo loudspeaker. Now, some of you might be quite reasonably asking, why buy a DWX stand mount when you can have the DW6 floor stander for a few $100s more? Now, I'm going to answer this question with another question, in that, can you turn the DW6 upside down? Because if you look behind me right now, my pair of DWX are sitting on the Wharfedale Linton stands, and they are upside down, because the super tweeter, not a tweeter, super tweeter, is at the bottom very close to the stand. Now, I've done that because I know that most of the high frequency information, but not all of it, is coming from the full range driver. So whether we turn them the right way up or upside down, that full range driver is still roughly at ear level. And with that tweeter sitting lower, we get a sound that seems to be richer in mid-range harmonics. And no, the soundstage doesn't collapse. These sort of atmospheric things that we hear when watching a TV show on Netflix, they don't disappear either. They just sit ever so slightly lower. It's not a night and day difference. In fact, it's a tiny difference. But I think the bigger difference really applies to voices when watching TV, because this loudspeaker's sound, being that kind of meaty mid-range sound, is excellent for watching, I guess, police dramas. I've been watching Hijack on Apple TV in the last 7 weeks. And so, yeah, the Zoos are great for that. But if we turn the Zoo speakers the right way up and put them on the PSB stands, so they sit lower, but they're canted back slightly, we get a slightly airier presentation, but we lose some of that sort of mid-range chewiness that I enjoyed with the speakers as they are now. And as they are now is how I prefer the sound of these loudspeakers. Yeah, upside down, pretty wacky, huh? But you don't have to do that. And again, I must stress this, it is not a big difference between having them the right way up. It's just that I prefer this sound like this. Now, all of this experimentation was inspired by Srajan Ebaen, who wrote a review of the DWX over on his website, 6 Moons. And Srajan and I are going to be convening on the Darko audio podcast pretty soon, I think, to talk about our experiences with this loudspeaker, because we both had them for an extended period of time. So if you want to know when that podcast hits, you're going to need to subscribe to this channel, because I'm going to push it out on the community page. But I want to wrap this review in talking about the F word. And I'm talking about the F word, fun. Because the Zoos are, I guess, more fun to listen to than the Wharfedale and the Bowers. They're more sort of serious, sort of audiophile, furrowed brow kind of speakers. I don't think the Zoos play it that way. Zoo speakers, in my experience, never have played it that way, and the DWX are no exception. But one surprising quality that I didn't expect from the DWX is another F word, and that is finesse. Because even though there isn't a lot of lower treble bite, there's just a very smooth, lovely, detailed sound coming out of that super tweeter. And I'll add this, because this is quite an unusual finding, is that of all of the loudspeakers that I've mentioned today, so the Bowers, the PSB, and the Wharfedale, I enjoy my vinyl rig more through the Zoo DWX than any of those other loudspeakers. And I think it is due to, well, maybe it's because that super tweeter is not having to do the work of a normal tweeter, in that it doesn't have to go all the way down to 2 or 3K. It only has to go down to roughly 12K. Maybe that's why, because I get a beautifully finessed sound from my Thorens turntable and PS Audio phono stage. And I'm not saying I don't get that from the Bowers or from the PSB or the Wharfedale, but it's more overt with the Zoo DWX. So yeah, fun and finesse, with a bit of funk thrown in for good measure. 3 F words. I think, yeah, they are the 3 F words that best describe this latest stand mount from Zoo Audio. So anyway, if you liked this video, if you thought it was entertaining or informative or a bit of both, then please consider giving us a like down below. If you like my attitude towards, I guess, again, side-by-side comparisons, I've done a lot in this video, but with a multitude of different loudspeakers. If you dig that, then please consider subscribing to this channel. And as always, thank you ever so much for watching. Hello, me again. You're watching this video on YouTube, and yes, I sound pretty hoarse today. I have suffered 4 weeks of what I thought was hay fever, but it turns out, I think maybe, God, I can't believe I'm saying this. I think I might be allergic to some kind of nuts. So I have been suffering for weeks with this kind of allergy thing, not knowing why. And yesterday I worked it out, I think, because I've not had any nuts today. I know this is a weird thing to be ending a video with. But anyway, I'm just explaining this because that's why my voice sounds different in this video. Now, I'm also wanting to explain here that my next video is going to be a review of the new Sony True Wireless IEMs, the WF-1000XM5. And that will not be appearing here on YouTube. That will only be appearing over on Patreon. So if you would consider supporting me over on Patreon, even if it's just for a month, just to buy me a cup of coffee or something, that would be absolutely fantastic. Thank you very much.